Hello, everyone. Welcome to Big Jeff's Football Insights on the Big Ten Huddle. I'm your host, Big Jeff McMichael, recording this on Thursday afternoon. So, with the way the news cycle is going, I'm sure something big will come down tonight before we release this on Friday morning. But as usual, just a reminder, please like the podcast for us, forward it. Subscribe to the Big Ten Huddle if you haven't already done that. Our goal is to cover all the Big Ten teams in a comprehensive way and very unbiased way, although hard to be real biased when we're supporting the number one conference in the country, of course. What a huge week for the Big Ten as we pursue our third straight national championship. I want to talk a little personally about this. If you can see what I'm wearing, you're probably going to know where I'm going with this. But just probably remains the craziest year for me personally in college football. You know, my boyhood favorite team was Ohio State. As many of you maybe know, they tried to defend the national title. They actually had a dang good year considering how much talent they lost. But they came up short. I'm a 1990 graduate of Indiana, a long-suffering Hoosier fan, and it's always been my second team to Ohio State on the other end of the spectrum. But here we are in a dreamland for Indiana fans. Number one in the country, Big Ten champion, beat the biggest of the Blue Bloods, Alabama, in a dominant game in the Rose Bowl. So the Rose Bowl champions for the first time ever. And then they're 2 games away from being national champions. What the hell is going on around here? It's just a crazy town. Doing things that the basketball program is supposed to be doing. Just to add to that, folks, I live in Atlanta, ground zero of SEC country. I have many friends who are Georgia fans and Bama and you name it. So it was so sweet when Indiana beat down Alabama. I could tell you from being down here, until Indiana beat an SEC high-level blue blood team, they really weren't going to believe. So the wins at Oregon and at Ohio State were great, and it caused SEC fans to say, "Wow, Indiana really is good." But they weren't convinced they were elite, and that beatdown in the Rose Bowl of Bama really finally made believers of them. And a lot of people are telling me that. So it's just a really cool thing to see all that happen. So I have tickets Friday night to the game. I am taking my 17 and 20-year-old. We are going to be 10-yard line, row 30. So really good tickets. So just a kind of side note on my boys, they're Ohio State fans because Ohio State's always won a lot, so they're fun to watch. We went to the Michigan fiasco last year when Ohio State got lost at home, but then played the championship game against Notre Dame here in Atlanta, and we got to go to that expensive ticket, but we had the time of our lives. So for this one, and for Indiana, I was always like, let's watch Indiana football. And they'd be like, Dad, why do we want to watch this team? They almost never win, and they're not real fun to root for. And I was like, I get it, right? So they're going to go to the games just as football fans. They both played football in high school. So really exciting, and it's going to be a fun time on Friday for that game. So let's talk about the agenda for today, though. And 3 things we're going to cover. Number 1, I am going to talk about the Big Ten, some of the bowl games and the records to date, some takeaways from that. Not spend too long on that. Then my brief special topic, I'm going to talk about the importance of Indiana's age and experience. I think it's some people have talked about it for sure, but I think it's really understated, I guess, the importance of that to their success. And then the third thing, we are going to do a review of the Oregon at Indiana matchup. And apologize to Oregon fans, I don't mean to sound all Indiana here. You definitely have a great chance to win it all. There's no doubt in my mind. So don't want to, pretend that you're this huge underdog or anything, because that's certainly not the case. But mine's going to be a little different than JR and Zach's take. So we're going to review that. So those 3 things are what we're going to cover in the agenda today. So let me bring up the bowl results here. So I have a table here. We're going to talk just how amazing it's been. Just a great postseason for the Big Ten so far, especially with the SEC really falling on their face. The SEC is 4-9 in bowl and playoff games combined. Two of those four wins were against each other. So, I mean, when you really think, if you extract that out, the SEC is 2-7 when they're not playing themselves. That's atrocious. And that you can talk about opt-outs all you want. That's just bad. The Big Ten, 9-4 overall. Most importantly, 3-1 in the playoffs, of course. And then also very important, 3-1 directly against the SEC. The only loss was Michigan losing to Texas, and with all the coaching turmoil, I'm going to give Michigan a pass on that one. Now, in this table, you're going to see my personal picks. Ironically, my record against the FanDuel spread is 9-4 so far. So exactly the same record as the Big Ten is. So I'm 9-4 versus the FanDuel spread. This table shows it. So any row primarily in green are the ones I got right. You can see my prediction in the scores. I'm not going to go through each one. And anything in the tan cells are what I got wrong. So the four wrong ones for me, I had Oregon covering against James Madison. I mean, Oregon was dominating. That was like a late cover, which is why anytime you get those big spreads, they're just hard to bet on. Tennessee losing to Illinois. I thought Tennessee might do it, but Brett Bielema proved me wrong there. I had USC covering against TCU, and that was a bad loss. And then, of course, the Ohio State game. I had Ohio State beating Miami. At this point, Indiana is the only team who got a bye in the last 2 years who won their second round game. So, the bye teams are 1-7. Indiana setting, first time things left and right here under Kirk Cignetti. The most important and best win easily was that Indiana blowout against Alabama. I mentioned all the reasons for that earlier. Caused even Paul Feinbaum to basically capitulate, right, and admit Indiana is an elite team. So that was huge. The worst loss was Ohio State losing to Miami. For specifically to Ohio State, I think the biggest takeaway, their offensive line was not championship caliber. I think we saw that during the year, given the lack of a strong running game from Ohio State. And then when they played great defensive lines, like, Texas, Indiana had a great front seven. And then certainly we saw that against Miami with their great defensive line. They really struggled. So I just think Ohio State's offensive line was average or a little better than average. Given that, it's hard to win a national title with an average line. They had enough eliteness across other position groups where maybe they could have overcome that. But the other thing is, Julian Sayin being a first-year starting quarterback, as good as he was and his future is super bright, when you're a first-year starting quarterback, you're still in learning mode very much, right? So you see that big leap second year in starting, and his inexperience showed where he got impatient, kind of didn't throw the ball away at times when he should have. And then when he had a chance to run to pick up some yardage, pick up a first down, he wasn't doing it. So all those things I think are teachable, but they kind of paid for that. And then just in general, when you've won it all, it's rat poison. Everyone's been telling you for a full year how great you are. It's hard to keep that psychological edge and that same focus. You can talk all you want to try to do that, but it's very difficult. That's why you see very few teams in college football or college sports, let alone in pro sports, repeating as champs. So just beyond that, the playoff games on the bad side for the Big Ten, really two games stand out to me. USC, I mentioned it, losing a late lead to TCU and losing the game, that was really bad. USC made strong progress under Lincoln Riley this year for sure, but that loss reminded me of 2 years ago in USC's first season in the Big Ten when they couldn't close out games, right? They were ahead in the second half, ahead in the fourth quarter many times, and they just poor end-of-game management. And so that's something Lincoln Riley needs to get better at. If you ask USC fans, they feel him calling plays distracts him maybe from properly managing those end of game situations. But that was really disappointing. And then the other one that stands out to me is Nebraska's loss. I mean, getting the doors blown out by Utah, who's a good team, but they're not a great team. Losing by 22 points. I know they didn't have their star running back, Emmett Johnson, but all kinds of teams deal with key players being out, in these bowl games. So to be uncompetitive in the bowl game is the bigger issue. If they were to lose, I would get it. And then how they finished 7-6 on the year, lost their last 3 games when you include that bowl game. And then they lose Dylan Raiola, right, who would have been in his 3rd year next year. So that's a big loss. So, if you're a Husker fan, you have to be very frustrated. You're wondering if Matt Rule really can take you to the next level as a program. And with his new contract, that Penn State job became available. Nebraska felt they had to, up his contract. Unfortunately, he's going to have one of the most pressure on him than any Big Ten coach next year, because 7-6 in his 3rd year is just not good enough. Frankly, it just isn't. There were some impressive non-playoff wins. So, the Washington spanking Boise State by 28, that's awesome. Got to be frustrating for Washington fans on the Damon Williams situation. I'm not going to go in that here, but potentially losing him as a quarterback, that's a heavy hit. Northwestern easily beating Central Michigan by 17 says a lot about the future for David Braun. They got Aiden Childs coming in as a transfer quarterback, the new stadium. So really things looking up for Northwestern, which is really cool. I thought it was great. Penn State, super disappointing year. Here they are playing Clemson. People were not surprised Penn State would play Clemson, thinking it would probably be a Final Four game or maybe for the championship. Here they are playing in New York. But great to see, those seniors and experienced players, Kerry Smith getting a win to finish out their career. Illinois beating Tennessee, SEC direct win. 2nd year in a row, Bielema has pulled that off after last year beating South Carolina. That's awesome. And then Iowa looked mostly dominant. I felt they should have really won by more over Vanderbilt than 7 points, but they won, right? They covered the spread. So all of these are strong proof points for the Big Ten over the SEC. For sure. And to me, it just shows, the Big Ten is at least as good as the SEC based on the last 2 years of head-to-head results in our 2 championships. Really says we're better, right? So I think at least is the minimum someone could say. I think the only thing the SEC has, quote, superiority over the Big Ten on, I do think the bottom feeders, there's fewer of them in the SEC. And they're not as bad as ours, but that's nothing to hang your head on to say we're a better conference. So, the bottom line is the Big Ten is better right now. The Big Ten is in the best position they have been in probably in my lifetime. So I'm 58 years old, so it's a long time. And it just feels great to be in the Big Ten right now. All right, let's talk about my second topic here. So I'm going to take a little drink of water. I just want to talk about the importance of Indiana's age and experience for their success. And really, there's going to be takeaways here for other teams going forward. But, given Indiana's sudden crazy success last 2 years under Cignetti, many people have talked about, how are they pulling this off, right? And there's been many reasons cited. A lot of them are on the mark. There's multiple factors here. There's not any one thing. Number one, brought over those transfers from James Madison, and many of those players still are playing for Indiana here in the 2nd year under Cignetti. So cornerback D'Angelo Pons, wide receiver Elijah Surratt, linebacker Aiden Fisher, all came from James Madison. All, players are going to be NFL players for sure, and, strong performers on the field. The second factor for sure, the continuity of coaching staff. Cignetti brought almost his entire staff over from James Madison, probably except for Bob Bostat, the offensive line coach. And then a lot of them were even at Cignetti in this prior stop. So, Cignetti was able to hit the ground running. He those coaches know what Cignetti expects, the culture he wants, so he didn't have to coach up his own coaching staff like some new coaches have to that cobbled together a staff. So he's able to hit the ground running. And then just the quality of that staff is a huge deal. So defensive coordinator Brian Haynes, offensive coordinator Mike Shanahan, super highly respected, great coaches, of course, based on the on-field results. There's no question about that. And it's been, when it's the second year at Indiana coaching all those players. Coaching continuity is a huge deal. And then Cignetti himself worked under Nick Saban for years as a recruiting coordinator, has the same process-oriented philosophy of continuous improvement and never being satisfied. He brought that, philosophy that Saban has. What's the process? Getting better every day. If you focus on that, great results come as a byproduct of that. And you're seeing that at Indiana. And then Cignetti just knowing what type of players to bring in that fit the culture, even if they're not as highly rated. He wants guys that are hungry, maybe feel disrespected, and are just going to fit the philosophy and work really hard. But beyond that, when we talk about the age and the maturity of the players, I kind of want to get into that more. Indiana really reminds me of the Wisconsin model in the 2010s. Now, Wisconsin's had that model for a long time of having more experienced players, red shirt players that have been there 4 and 5 years. But it really kind of peaked, in my mind, in the 2010s. In that decade, if you look at it, Ohio State led the Big Ten in conference, within the Big Ten conference games. So we're excluding non-conference. Ohio State was number 1 in the 2010s, 88% winning percentage. Wisconsin was the clear number 2 in that decade. 76% conference win percentage Wisconsin had. Number 3 is who you might not think of, but probably in this mold of more experienced players fitting our culture, it's Michigan State. Michigan State had the 3rd best winning percentage, 67% in the 2010s. And then actually it was Penn State and Michigan finished 4th and 5th, respectively, 64% and 63% winning percentage. So, not what you think, like the Blue Bloods, Penn State and Michigan, 4th and 5th, right? And when you think of Wisconsin, though, in that time, almost never had a top 20 recruiting class. They would recruit guys that fit the culture of the program, often redshirting them, and they had guys that had been there 4 or 5 years. What you ended up with is a team with a bunch of starters in the 21 to 23-year-old age rates that were super mature, physically strong, more experience in life and in football. And so basically Wisconsin had grown men playing against some of the younger, more talented teams like in Ohio State of 18 to 20-year-olds, right? So basically the age and maturity of older teams, that's a great equalizer. And I strongly believe that's been a big secret and a much underrated aspect of this Indiana team this year. And that's not a dig at Indiana, right? That's just smart program management. And if you look at the data, it really supports that. So I ran some figures. I'm not going to show a table here, but Indiana's 11 offensive starters have a projected average age 22.4 years. So, right, Indiana's 11 starters, 22.4 years. Contract that with Alabama, their 11 offensive starters, 20.8 average years old. So that's 1.6 years younger than Indiana. Contrast also Ohio State starters, average 20.7 average age across those 11. So that's 1.7 years younger than Indiana. So if you look at Indiana, their youngest offensive starters, 21 years old. All 10 of the other starters are at least 22 years old. And they even have two 24-year-olds, running back Kalon Black, who you're going to see a lot tomorrow night for sure, and tight end Riley Nowakowski, transferred from Wisconsin. They're both 24 years old. Fernando Mendoza is 22 years old, by the way. So just very experienced team. And then if you look at Ohio State in more detail, started 19-year-old true freshman Bo Jackson at running back. Julian Sayin, only 20 years old and the first year starting. So 8 of Ohio State's 11 starters were 21 or under. And those 11 star-studded receivers for Ohio State, yeah, super, super talented, but they're only 20 years old. So, I'm not saying feel sorry for Ohio State here, because they're super talented. But the fact is, Indiana's players' age, maturity, experience really explains some of their success, and it's also going to explain why I think on the big stage here, it's not going to be too much for them because of that experience. And I could just tell you, as a father of 2 boys who are 17 and 20, a year and a half might not sound like a lot to some people, but at that age, the level of, mental and physical change in a year and a half can be quite substantial. So it shouldn't be underestimated. Just to finish that out, Indiana's defense I did look at as well. Similar, not quite as young. So their 11 starters average 21.9 years old. So still a little bit older. The oldest starter, Lewis Moore, is 25 years old. I mean, again, grown man here playing college football. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you can do it, it makes a lot of sense. I just think the takeaways going forward, you're going to see many more teams emphasize experience production as Cignetti has done here. You see that in basketball in the past. Think of, all the Cinderella teams, these smaller schools that are winning big, often out of nowhere. And it's really not out of nowhere. They tend to have older players who have been around, have some good experience, and they do really well, right? They're just taking advantage of the fact of that experience and that advanced maturity. So the transfer portal going forward, going to be more important than ever. We're seeing that this year, of course. I still maintain high school recruiting is still going to be very important. It's going to be kind of like the anchor or the frame, the foundation of your program for sure. There's certain players that want to play 3 years at one school, still make money, right, in NIL, but they want to be at one school. And so recruiting is not going away. I don't care what you read there, but the dynamic of it certainly is changing, right? Maybe you de-emphasize it and not go for as many players. And so, again, I think Indiana's experience is going to be a major factor here as they try to complete winning these last 2 games to win the championship. All right, let's talk about the third subject, which is the game here in Atlanta, the Peach Bowl. Indiana is a FanDuel 3.5-point favorite over Oregon. The over-under is 46.5 in this game. Of course, this game guarantees that Big Ten has someone in the championship game. I think, the fact that if one of these teams wins it all, that not only the Big Ten will have 3 straight national champions, the fact it came from 3 different schools is even better than if Ohio State repeated, right? I mean, it kind of shows the top of our conference is deep, right? If you have a deep top, that's really good. That's what SEC used to be. It certainly isn't now. For Indiana, they're number 1 in the nation, 14-0. If they finish out 16-0, they'll be the first team ever to go 16-0. So that's a really big deal. Oregon, 13-1 overall. Of course, the only loss was to Indiana, 30-20 in what was it, week 6, I think. Oregon's won 2 in a row. Has looked really good. James Madison won by 17. It was really not that close, really. And then Texas Tech, 23-0. Defense pretty great. They needed to do better at scoring in the red zone, right? That was a big factor in that game. It should have been more. SP Plus, ESPN SP Plus, Indiana's ranked number 1 overall, has the number 2 ranked defense and the number 3 offense. So amazing balance for Indiana, and that's what you want to be. Oregon ranks number 3 per SP Plus with the 3rd ranked defense and the number 7 ranked offense. By the way, Ohio State, even after the loss to Miami, they're still ranked number 2 by SP Plus. I think Ohio State is a bad matchup also with Miami. Miami's strong defensive line, elite defensive line, I should say, against that average that I already talked about, offensive line was just a bad matchup. So a lot of these games are about the luck of the draw of the matchup you got. Football is about matchups and motivation. Um, so but Ohio State, when you think about in Indiana and Oregon per SP Plus, we have the top 3 SP Plus teams in the nation, which is really cool. If you look at the top 16 teams per SP Plus, the Big Ten has 7, the SEC only has 5. So again, even our mid-level teams we have more of right now. In the top 25 SP Plus, SEC has 9 teams, Big Ten has 8. So just looking at the spread for the season, I think it's interesting. Both Oregon and Indiana are 9-5 for the year against the spread. Oregon has won 4 of the last 5, and Indiana has covered their past 3 games versus the spread. The first game when Indiana played Oregon, the Hoosiers clearly outplayed Oregon on the road, a very impressive win, and they deserved to win. And in the key metrics, Indiana was better. Total yards, Indiana 326, Oregon 267. First downs, Indiana had 23, Oregon 14. Rushing yards, Indiana 111, Oregon 81. And very importantly, turnovers, Indiana 1, Oregon 2. And in sacks, kind of havoc, Indiana was 6, Oregon with 1. So those are some really key metrics there that Indiana was clearly better than. But the reality was, going into the fourth quarter, Oregon was only down by 1 score, 20-13. Mendoza threw that pick 6 to Brandon Finney Jr. to make it 20-20 in the fourth quarter. The thing is, Indiana followed that right up with a 12-play, 75-yard drive by Mendoza. And then the Ducks' 3 fourth-quarter drives were terrible. 6 plays for 8 yards and a punt, 2 plays for -4 yards and an interception, and then 1 play basically for an interception, so 0 yards. So, in crunch time, Indiana far outplayed Oregon, and that was the big difference in the game. Up till then, Indiana was playing better up front, but it wasn't like this huge advantage. The other thing to note, how Oregon totally contained the Indiana rushing attack, so only gave up 111 yards and 3 yards a carry. Now, conversely, Indiana mostly shut down Oregon's really impressive running game. So Oregon only had 81 yards rushing for 2.7 yards per carry. Now, it did include, in college, they include sacks in the rushing total. So Dante Moore had -27 rushing yards. So that's a big factor in that small yards per carry. But reality is both teams really contain the other's running game. And if you really look at those numbers in the first game, I feel, Indiana won the game because Fernando Mendoza outplayed Dante Moore. The quarterback rating for Mendoza was 91. For Moore, it was 35.1 QBR. And Moore had those 2 interceptions in the fourth quarter. Mendoza had the 1, but then he had the clutch drive. So really, for Oregon to win the second time around, Dante Moore needs to play at least approximately to the level of Mendoza. And if he plays better than Mendoza, which he's perfectly capable of, I think Oregon can pull the minor upset versus Indiana. It's only a 3.5-point spread. All right, let's get into 3 specific reasons why I think Indiana can cover that 3.5 points, though. Number 1, Indiana is playing with absolute confidence. They can not only beat any team, that they are the best team in the nation and led by the best defense in the nation. So let's dig deeper on that. I felt Indiana against Iowa specifically. I felt if Mark Gronowski didn't get hurt in the second half, I think they lose that game. But they found a way to pull it out. And that game did raise some concerns, but then they went to Oregon and were resilient, right? Despite that pick 6. And once they won at Oregon, that's when the confidence really took off from a team perspective, and then, as a fan perspective for sure. It helped them in that game against Penn State on the road behind. It took that great catch from Omar Cooper Jr., but still, these are all building blocks of confidence. And then once they placed Ohio State, they truly believed. I mean, you didn't have to convince them. They really felt they were going to win that football game, and they did. So that belief is really good. A team is dangerous when they believe, when they're hungry, like Indiana is. Indiana was certainly hungrier than Ohio State was, and that makes them dangerous. And then to add that, the strength of this team the last 2 years, offense has been really good. Mendoza's spectacular, but the strength really is this defense. They're second in the nation only to Ohio State in total defense, giving up 253 yards a game. Second to Ohio State in scoring defense, only give up 10.3 points a game. And then this defense certainly can contain any offense. They only gave up 13 points to Oregon if you extract out Mendoza's pick six. 13 points on the road to Oregon's offense is amazing. And then 267 yards they gave up only to the Ducks. So clearly the team has the confidence and the defense to be able to beat Oregon. Number two, Indiana's havoc making ability, really created by that defense. Excellent at generating turnovers. They had 2 interceptions the first time against Dante Moore. Plus, their offense is amazing at limiting mistakes. So in games where two teams are fairly even when it comes to personnel, which I do believe these two teams are, mistakes, turnovers are often the difference. So let's dig deeper on that. No question, Indiana, huge key to success. Their turnover margin is plus 18. That is best in the Big Ten. It is tied for best in the nation with Arizona. They excel most in interceptions, so that ball hawking secondary, helped by the tough pass rush that they have. 17 interceptions for Indiana. That's 8th in the nation. And then Indiana has 26 turnovers gained overall. That's 6th in the nation. And on the other side, the offense, only 8 turnovers lost. That's 3rd in the nation. So of those eight turnovers, 7 of them are Mendoza interceptions. And it really means only 1 fumble in the running game. So they just don't fumble the ball when running it. And Mendoza is one of those runners. So that's just an impressive stat. Mentioned this already, won the turnover battle in the first game against Oregon 2-1. So, which team is likely to make a key turnover? It would be Oregon, even though Oregon actually doesn't have a bad turnover ratio at all. They're quite good as well. So number 3, Fernando Mendoza has been great all year, but in these last 2 games, he has played at an even higher level, and importantly, mostly eliminated those critical, interceptions he had in some earlier big games. So, going deeper on that, Mendoza, he did come through in the clutch against Iowa after having an interception. Oregon, that pick 6. Penn State, he had an interception late in that game as well. And so the reality of those games is because Mendoza had a key turnover, it required him to play amazing down the stretch and have clutch drives, which he was able to do. I kind of felt that was underrated in the Heisman conversation, frankly, because some of the need to come from behind was due to Mendoza making mistakes. But now, in the last 2 games, he really hasn't done that. He had an interception against Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. I would argue that was a really good defensive play from Ohio State. It was like a screen where Ohio State kind of blew up the play and intercepted. To me, that wasn't really a bad throw like some of the other interceptions that Mendoza had. And then we know against Ohio State, he had the great TD pass to Surratt. He had the, 3rd down late fourth quarter play to Charlie Becker, and those were amazing throws in tight windows. Against Alabama, Mendoza was close to perfect, 14 of 16 for 192 yards, 3 TDs, no interceptions. I was worried about, the curse of the Heisman Trophy and all the rat poison and everyone, you're just kind of losing your focus, which can happen after you've won the Heisman. We're seeing none of that from Mendoza. And so that's the third reason, really believe in Indiana's ability to cover that spread. Is just Mendoza is just taking his game to a whole new level the last 2 games. So why take the points with Oregon? I'm going to cover 2 things here. Certainly there's more reasons, but 2 things to really speak about. Oregon mostly shut down the Indiana rushing attack in game 1. We've talked about that. And IU has struggled against very good front sevens more than people realize. If Oregon can contain that run game again and make IU one-dimensional, and they're very capable of doing that, Mendoza is going to have to play elite again for them to win, for Indiana to win and get that cover. Mendoza is perfectly capable of that, but it's hard to play elite game after game, especially against great competition. So, let's talk to that more than that Indiana run game. So, identified late in the season this as an aspect against talented and physical front sevens. The Big Ten leading rushing offense for Indiana is not nearly as good. So Indiana averages 221 yards per game. That's best in the Big Ten and 11th in the nation. But in the 9 games against what I consider weaker rated defensive fronts, Indiana averaged 285 rushing yards a game. That's 6.5 yards per carry. So they just cleaned house on some of those weaker teams. But if you look at the 5 games that I consider against really talented and highly rated front sevens, they averaged in those 5 games 105 rushing yards at 2.9 yards per carry. So way different. So their great rushing statistics was driven heavily off of those weaker offenses. The 5 teams I'm calling, really strong up front are Iowa, Oregon, Penn State, Wisconsin, and Ohio State. Now, Penn State statistically wasn't nearly as high as the others, but the other 4 really were good front sevens and really good against the rush defense. In the last 2 games is a good example. Against Ohio State, in the Big Ten championship game, Indiana had 118 yards rushing at 3.5 yards per carry. So I'm not saying that's bad. It was good enough to get the win, but that's not like, oh, wow, 3.5 yards per carry. They were, really, kind of dominating Ohio State in the rush game. That's really not the case. It was the Indiana defense and Mendoza's clutch-making throws that really was the reason. The rushing game did enough. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that was bad, but it was other things that really carried the day. Against Alabama, Indiana, 215 rushing yards, 4.3 yards per carry. Now that one, was much better, but Alabama is not among those 5 teams I consider elite front seven. And a lot of that also was once Alabama quit, and I really think they did quit, that's where Indiana really piled up those yards. So, if you look at Oregon, they have the personnel and stats to really be capable of keeping that Indiana running game in check. In that first game, held Indiana to 3 yards per carry. Oregon for the year is number 6 in the Big Ten, number 19 in the nation in rushing defense. That might not sound like spectacular, but consider they only average giving up 111 rush yards per game and 3.3 yards per carry. So that's really solid run defense. Also, the Ducks big and physical up front. Don't have a weak player across that front 4. Pro Football Focus, all 4 players strongly in the green, if you're familiar with Pro Football Focus. Junior defensive end, Tuioti, for example, 59th among 870 players in the nation in their rating. So that's super high. And then their defensive tackle, junior Amari Washington, 45th of 911 defensive ends. And all 4 guys just really solid. Oregon might not have great linebackers, but they're still good. And so really, they do have the personnel that could contain that rushing game, and that would be a big deal. I know Zach and JR really hit on that as well. Just number two, why Oregon can do this. I just think the Indiana hype train is about as close to peak as you can get. Obviously, if they become national champs, it will be the peak. But Dan Lanning quite good at motivating and using the disrespect card here. So at this point, Indiana, any of the non-believers have been vanquished. They're getting across the board great respect. And Cignetti has used that disrespect card a lot to motivate his team. He's not going to have that here. Now, I'd like to think the maturity of his team will mean that won't matter, but that could be a factor here. But if I were going to give the psychological edge, in that disrespect card, I'm going to give that to Oregon in this one and Dan Lanning. So what's my call on this one? Going to mention a couple other things. In my analysis yet, I haven't talked about continuity of staff, and so I do think that favors Indiana. Both coordinators have new head coaching jobs. Josh Lapoy is going to California, Will Stein to Kentucky. It's very hard to create great game plans and put in the work needed when you're doing two jobs at once. So that's going to be a factor. Was a factor for Ohio State and Brian Hartline, the offensive coordinator, who's going to be a South Florida coach. So that's a pretty big deal, I think. Key injuries is another X factor for Oregon. Jordan Davison announced not playing, got hurt in the last game. First game, 8 carries for 59 yards against Indiana. That's a big deal. He's got I think 14 touchdowns. So Oregon has a deep running back room, but it's been hit pretty hard. So that is significant. But beyond that, these two teams very close. I give the edge to Indiana in defense. But when you're this close, it's going to come down to the basics of football. Who's going to win up front on both sides of the ball? Who wins the turnover battle, which Indiana is more likely to? And then what team executes best during clutch moments? Third and fourth downs, who's coming through with those? Who's executing better in the red zone? All those things Indiana is doing better here in these playoff games. Indiana's only had one. So I think that does favor Indiana. I expect Dan Lanning to be very aggressive here because I think he knows he needs to be a little more aggressive. But at this point, how can you bet against Kurt Cignetti? I'm wearing an Indiana shirt. I'm an Indiana grad. I can't get bet against Kurt Cignetti. I think Oregon and Dante Moore keep this close, though. They're too good not to, even though there is a scenario that Indiana, it could get away in the second half. I'm not making that call, but I am calling Indiana to win 30-20. So they will cover the 3.5 points and win by 10. But I do think it's going to be a great game. Very excited to be there. So that's it for this week. Please do follow me on X. I'm at Big Jeff's FT Ball. As always, we thank you for listening to the Big Ten Huddle, and we will see you next week on the Big Ten Huddle. Bye for now.